and welcome to the Cosmic Shambles regular Sunday Science question and answer session. We have we're responding to audience demand this week because we had so many questions on mental health last time we did this that we are going back to that topic for part 2, and you've sent even more questions, so who knows whether there'll be a part 3 or not, but we're going to try and get through as many as we can today. And just before we get started on all of that, the standard reminder, which does matter even though you've all heard it before, that if you can possibly support us on Patreon or in the tip jar, that is very much appreciated. Obviously, all live shows have stopped and are basically stopped for the foreseeable future. And so everyone who relied on live performances is now struggling a little bit. And if you do watch this regularly and you're doing all right, then, you know, a little contribution would be very much appreciated. Obviously, we try to make it free for as many people as possible, so if that's not you, that's okay. But if you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/cosmic shambles, that is an amazing thing. And if you do, there are Patreon only things now. So there's a Patreon only podcast documentary series, and I think the second episode has just gone out, and that is what I think of as one of Robin's favorite topics. It's nothing I know anything about, but it's called an uncanny hour, and this week's episode has Stuart Lee and Alan Moore, and they are talking about all sorts of things that if you're a Patreon supporter you can listen into. So coming up, we can't do live shows, but what we can do is online shows, even more online shows. And because we've been doing a lot of online shows, we can always make them bigger and better. And this is the biggest of all because Trent and Robin thought it would be a hilarious idea to do a 24-hour continuous show from noon on December the 12th, which is a Saturday, until noon on December the 13th. Me and everyone else think this is ridiculous, but that's never stopped Cosmic Shambles yet. So that will be 9 lessons and carols for socially distanced people, which is a brilliant title. And they're introducing lots of guests as time goes on. So guests announced this week include Nitin Sawhney, the astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti, and Rachel, the excellent Rachel House. So it will be free to watch online. But if you'd like to support all the charities, that's where the profits are going. And so you can buy a virtual ticket at crowdfunder.co.uk/9 lessons. And one of the charities we're supporting, which is very relevant to the topic we're dealing with today, is Mind for Better, which is a mental health charity. So as we're going along, we always appreciate more questions just to challenge everyone. So if you've got any questions, do put them in the live chat or tweet at Cosmic Shambles, and Trent will pick them up and pass them on. And one other thing is that Science Book Shambles podcast is still going on. And this week's episode, Robin and Josie were talking to Hugh Warwick, who is the very enthusiastic hedgehog expert. So if you want to know about hedgehogs or wildlife or any of those things, have a look for that Science Book Shambles podcast. Okay, so we'll get to actually before we get to our guest this week, I need to say something very important, which is that we are going to be talking about mental health, and obviously that may come along with discussions about things like suicide and self-harm. And so these are serious topics, and if it's important that you know that might be coming up. And in particular, the other thing is that our experts are all experts in their field, but they are speaking about everything generally, and none of this is intended as clinical advice. So, you know, that's an important thing to remember. If you need professional help, we are not professional help, but we might provide some insight into interesting questions. And also, some of today's questions will be anonymous for obvious reasons. So let's get to our 3 guests and what they've got to show us. So we have Dean Burnett, Nav Kapur, and Suzi Gage. So let's start with Dean, scientist who has Dean,
sorry to bore you.
How are you doing? We should ask that question, right? Yeah. It's a mental health session. How are you doing today?
All right. Yeah, it's been a tough time of things the last few months. The last couple of weeks ago, nothing bad has happened that I'm aware of, so that's usually a good sign. And so obviously the election thing was yesterday, which was quite a tumultuous event, but in a good way. Not much to report really since we last spoke. So
it's like cool. Updates. It's like the weather forecast, isn't it?
Yes.
More of that.
Great. Yes.
Shipping forecast. Okay, what's your show and tell for us?
Well, I scoured my bookshelf to find something of interest, and I found a few nostalgia picks. Because I got the Thick of It book from like 2010, I believe, before the Conservative coalition government came in, and obviously it's a satirical political show. But it's quite. I used to read this and laugh, thinking this is so funny, but also now read it thinking. A fond nostalgia for a time when this was as ridiculous as politics could possibly get. Because I've read it again recently, thinking there's nothing in here which it all seems so sober and restrained compared to the last 5 years or the last 24 hours. So it's a good book for nostalgic reasons now, as well as comedic appreciation. And my other one was my oldest thing is it's a program from The Bed Sitting Room, written by Spike Milligan, the play from the 1960s.
Wow. That's brilliant.
Program cost £1, written by John Antrobus and Spike Milligan. I got this because I actually put it on as a production in the drama club when I was in university, and I just bring it up now because the conceit of the play is that a man, because of a post-apocalyptic world where the nukes have fallen, one of the main characters transforms into a bed-sitting room. He becomes a one-room flat, and the main characters decide to live inside him. So it's farcical, but. I think because I've spent so much time here now because of lockdown in my own little outdoor office, I'm starting to feel it's happening to me. Because now my wife says, "Where are you going?" I'm office. I'm off.
Have you started talking to your wooden box yet? I guess that's the test, isn't it?
I'm more concerned with the fact I feel like it's talking to me, which is probably worse in the long run.
What's it saying?
Just like, all right, it's bored as well, which is just really quite depressing. I'm having a very, very, very dull psychological break. So,
I'm not sure if you're recommending this as a way to help with mental health. You should have an imaginary friend. Although I'd get to go back to your first object, that thing about the thick of it. What is even more brilliant, I think, is that I was brought up on Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, and that was 1978 that I think those came out, and it's still true. Apparently humans don't change. There's all these technological advances and the internet and spaceships and things, and basically Yes Minister has still got it right.
Technology changes, people don't so much. So yes, that's probably a good rule of thumb.
Brilliant. All right, well, let us move on to Dr. Suzi Gage, who is a drugs and mental health researcher, and her great brilliant book, Say Why to Drugs, is out now, and she also has a podcast. Suzi, how are you doing?
Hello, I am good, thank you. Yes. I think some people know that I'm imminently about to have a baby, so if I sort of look a bit pained, then that's probably why. I've been living it's quite uncomfortable. I've got to the very uncomfortable stage of pregnancy, but I'm really good.
Brilliant. And Trent did point out that having a baby during the question and answer points as the ultimate commitment to the Cosmic Shambles show and tell cause. But assuming that the baby is not going to come in the next 2 minutes, what is the show and tell you've got for us?
Well, I was going to show you my cat, but because I was thinking about things that are sort of helping me keep my mental health positive during lockdown and that kind of thing. And my cat is just amazing, and he sort of keeps me company and gives affection sometimes. But while you were doing the introduction, he crept in, and I suddenly heard him drinking my glass of water that's on the floor next to me. So he's sort of not in my good books at the moment. But if you want a rough idea of what he looks like, then this lucky cat on my piano here, my husband painted it so that it looks like our cat, and that was my birthday present a couple of years ago. But so that's my cat. Caligula, his name is.
He sounded like a friendly cat until you said he was called Caligula. I think painting the statue like the cat is the perfect example of that, saying that dogs have owners and cats have staff, right? Yeah. I don't know how the baby and the cat are going to, the relative importance in the house could be problematic.
Well, the cat's been particularly loving recently, and I think it's because he senses that something's about to change. So he's trying to make sure we don't forget him.
About to get booted out. Well, or at least demoted by one. Brilliant. And we also have Nav Kapur, who's a professor of psychiatry and population health at the University of Manchester. Nav, how are you doing today?
I'm doing not too bad. Entertained and bewildered by events across the other side of the Atlantic, but it's good. It makes a bit of a welcome change from everything else that's going on. But
I did wake up this morning for the first time, and I felt I should check the news, and then I realized I didn't have to check. That feeling of that thing when you look at your watch and you don't really look at your watch, but you keep looking at your watch. I feel like I'm now doing that. Like, what do I must need to check something. So what have you got to tell?
I've got this fella here.
Ooh,
I've got this fella here. He's a He's a Kathakali dancer from India, and he illustrates the importance of kindness to mental health, and also the importance of non-verbal communication in understanding human behaviour. So basically, one of my students went to India and brought me this fella back and gave him to me as a gift, and that was really good for my mental health. That bit of kindness, it was absolutely fantastic. It made me feel really good. And then I had a closer look at him, and I had a little look at him, and there's the name. His name is Bhima, and Bhima is one of the heroes from the Hindu epic, the Mahabharata. And he's a strong man, and he bludgeons his enemies rather than talks to them. And I reflected this was my student kind of unconsciously or non-verbally communicating to me something about my supervision style. So kindness, but also non-verbal communication.
That is that thing about an iron fist and a velvet glove, isn't it? Right. I think so. Carlo Rovelli, the physicist, has just written a book called "There Are Places in the World Where Kindness is More Important Than the Rules," which I think, whatever's in the book, is quite a good title in general. I like that principle. Brilliant. Thank you. Right. We're going to get straight on with our questions because we are going to try to get through them all. I'm certain we won't succeed, but we're going to try. We're going to start with a couple of specific ones. There's so many here. The mental health questions are so varied. Dean, first of all, there is a question for you from Gilbert T, which says, and they're talking about the lockdown, because I guess a lot of these questions do start with lockdown number 2, although you in Wales have been here for a while. So is it possible for people to get oxytocin withdrawal during something like this? Presumably lots of people aren't getting the same amount of stimulus. They can't go to the pub, they can't go to concerts. Or is Netflix and the internet good enough?
Interesting question. It's like, I think the idea of oxytocin withdrawal, it does sort of suggests an oversimplified view of how things kind of work in the brain. I mean, neurotransmitters have these roles, but they don't have. I know, there was a thing a little while ago from like Silicon Valley, dopamine fasting. It's basically just a bit of self-restraint. It's just like showing a bit of disengagement, but you have to give it a cool name. So it's it's not such a chemical thing, but we are very social creatures, like the oxytocin and vasopressin in men as well. The systems which coordinate our emotional attachments and engagements and enhance and amplify them. Yeah, they won't be getting as used when you're completely cut off from your friends and family and your wider community. It's not necessarily a damaging thing in that these things tend to bounce back. The brain is a lot more resilient, a lot more flexible than people often give it credit for. As in, a few months this bad thing happens, but then when things go back to quote unquote normal, then you could expect to see some recovery, quite a lot perhaps in that respect. But yeah, so there will be a definite case of we are not engaged in our social processes as much as we would like to be, because we are an incredibly social species and a lot of the brain is dedicated to that. And so things like online communication like this, it can be a useful stopgap. I don't think it's necessarily a complete replacement, because there is so much that humans give off in their in their physical form. Like body language is such a big part of communication. As Nav said, like non-verbal communication is a really big deal on the emotional level, on the well-being level, the communication level. And the technology now is a lot better than it was. I mean, the idea of doing this 10 years ago even is kind of frightening. But we have at least some connections now. But yeah, it's not complete adequate replacement. It's sort of like having refined sugar instead of fruits and things. Like, it gives you energy, it gives you some stuff you need, but it's not great. It doesn't cover all the bases, but it'll do for now. So yeah.
So do we know? Are there any sort of long-term? I mean, to any of you, are there any sort of long-term consequences? Do we know anything about? I guess this is the experiment going on right now. But do we know anything about if you take away those social interactions? What happens to you? I mean, I've certainly. Yeah. Does anyone know of any research on that? Are there any long-term consequences, or do you just kind of, it goes down for a bit, but then, like Dean says, it just goes back up and it's all right?
Well, again, you have to, by most psychological standards, solitary confinement in prison, being cut off from other human beings, is literally recognised as a form of torture. We just do not handle it well at all. So we know it's bad in that respect, at least. You think that?
It's bad. It's bad for you, Helen, as you've kind of surmised. and there are parallels from the incarceration kind of literature, but it is different. But I think it's kind of unquestionable. But Dean raises a really important point, which is we mustn't reduce mental health to individual neurotransmitters, individual hormones, or anything like that. That's quite kind of reductionist. But the overall point is, one of the things we should be doing for our mental health is making sure we're getting that kind of social stimulus in, as Dean says, it might be a kind of diluted form, but it's really important to keep those social connections going during this time. And I've got mixed feelings about doing all my socializing over my computer, but hey, we'll get through this, and it's time limited.
Yeah, and of course, oxytocin has loads of other roles as well as those roles. So, I mean,
yes,
it's really important in childbirth. So,
it sounds like you're obviously well educated, but you're well prepared for what's been going on inside your body, completely beyond your control.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to a question for you, Suzi. But the origin of this, I think this is more for you, although Nav might like to comment, because it comes from something he said last time in the first version of this discussion, which is that Nav, you said that we're seeing lower numbers of suicide linked to the pandemic and lockdown depression. And the question for Suzi is, if suicide and things like that have gone down, has there been any increase in drug use, substance abuse? Clearly, it's slightly difficult to monitor if everyone's locked away and you can't see what they're doing. But do we know anything about the patterns in substance use?
It's definitely something that people have been looking at during lockdown, yeah. So I've been involved in some research around alcohol use during lockdown, and there's been quite a lot of other stuff published looking at alcohol as well. And this has found some really interesting patterns, that it's not universal. It's not that everyone's drinking more or everyone's drinking less. There seem to be these sort of diverging patterns, and people who usually drink a little bit seem to be reporting drinking less during lockdown, and people who usually drink more are reporting, and this is obviously on average at a population level, there's lots of variation, but people who usually drink more seem to be drinking even more during lockdown, or certainly this was true in the first couple of months. Obviously, this research takes a while you have to collect the data and then analyze it, and so we're just now beginning to see the data that was collected right at the beginning of lockdown, and I think it's potentially possible that the first few months of lockdown or of coronavirus or of the whole world changing are quite different to how things are going to be going forward in the future as well. But these patterns seem to have come out of a few completely different data sets, so suggesting that this is quite a established pattern, certainly along in the beginning of lockdown anyway. And in terms of other illicit drug use, yeah, it's difficult to monitor, but people have been doing it in some really ingenious ways. So there's been a lot of qualitative studies conducted either by interviews or we've done some research where we looked at Reddit forums where people discuss their drug use and sort of scraped a load of posts off Reddit and analysed themes that come out of that, and found that people, for example, who are in recovery from dependence or problematic substance use can potentially find it really, really challenging when lockdown started, that a lot of the ways in which people dealt with cravings and that kind of things were taken away from them. So it would be go and see a friend, go for a walk, go and do some exercise, some of the things that we just couldn't do during the first lockdown in particular. So that can be really, really challenging. But also some people found that the change in their circumstances really led them to think about reevaluating lots of other things in their lives as well. So it was very individual types of patterns. And another way to look at whether substance use is changing is wastewater analysis. So I think this is really cool. You examine the wastewater and look for the metabolites of different substances in wastewater. And these seem to suggest that sort of party drug use has gone right down, as you might expect. Cannabis use seems to have gone up a little bit maybe, but cannabis use, when you interview people, seems to show the same pattern as alcohol use, that people who were using cannabis a little bit tended to be using it a bit less during lockdown, and people who were using cannabis a bit more tended to start using it maybe even more during lockdown. So there's really quite complicated patterns, and I don't think we know loads yet at the moment, but there does seem to be, these sort of interesting findings.
I think the wastewater information is so fascinating. So I have a Thames project monitoring the Thames, and we had some chemists come from the University of Portsmouth, I think, and they were talking about, you can basically tell when it's Friday, because there are overflows into the Thames, and they were not specific about exactly the positions on the river that they were coming from, but you can tell it's Friday because of what's in the water. Now, did you have something to add?
Yeah. So say what we're seeing at the moment from the worldwide literature is no evidence of the feared increase in suicide rates that we were all worried about. So it would be incorrect to say there's been a fall. There has been perhaps a fall in certain areas, a kind of social cohesion effect. But the important message is no evidence of the feared rise at the moment. We need to be very mindful of that. It's going to be different in different places. And when the economic consequences of all this bite, we might see further mental health effects. But that's really positive. And the other thing that Suzi said that I think is really important is the variability of all this. It has different effects on different people. And as we talked about briefly last time, for some people, lockdown one, they actually reported it being a positive experience, about a third of people. And other people found it very, very difficult. So you've got this challenge of the variability, but at the moment we're not seeing those impacts. So I think the drug misuse kind of stuff is absolutely fascinating. There are some data from the States that suggested that drug overdoses in people habitually using recreational drugs may have gone up during the first bit of the lockdown. That was the US, not here. But this is something we need to be keeping a close eye on, really.
Well, that takes us very nicely onto the next question from an anonymous person, but perhaps Nav, you can start with this, and then we'll move on to the others, which is about the potential positive effects of lockdown. So this person says they have severe social anxiety, and the whole thing's been a relief because they don't have to worry about how they're going to deal, the next time they're going to have to do something which gives them anxiety. And so the question is about the scope of potential positive impacts, and also, which then follows on, that if during lockdown things got easier for people with social anxiety, when lockdown goes away, the world's all coming back. What do we know about all of that?
I think there's two issues there. The first is for people with, perhaps specific psychological health problems and how that might have affected them. And I've heard this, from a few people. It's not just people with social anxiety, people with OCD, obsessional compulsive disorder. Other people have said we've actually found this a bit easier because we've not had to go out, we've not had to have that social contact, we've not had to go to work. So for some people it has been easier because they haven't had to do the things they find difficult in their everyday life. For other people it's been a positive thing because they've been able to do the things they haven't had time to do during, our busy, mad everyday lives. Things like spending a bit more time with the family, things like just taking a kind of step out. That was one of the things that I really noticed in the early part of lockdown, just how life kind of slowed down. And I think some of those things, there's almost a kind of cultural learning to all this that I think we can take forward positively when all this is over. When it all comes back, I don't think it's all suddenly going to come back. All the evidence, how we've been progressing over the last few months, suggests that any return is going to be incremental. And I think that will be helpful for people who might find the return to, so-called normal life kind of challenging. It will be incremental. And we have kind of learned things while we've been in this period of kind of societal lockdown that I think we can take forward. So I think it's going to be gradual. I don't think there's going to be a sudden return.
Dean, do you have any thoughts about the negative and positive impacts of lockdown?
Yeah, it's actually something that's come up a lot. Like Nav says, I've heard plenty of people say this is actually, they're quite not happy about the situation, but it's easier for them than before lockdown was the case. And you can sort of see many different factors which would lead into that. One thing, a number of the studies I've seen which monitoring the general mental health of the population since this all started is that adolescent mental health, which you'd expect perhaps to be the most heavily impacted by not being able to see their friends, not going to school, being stuck indoors with their parents at all times, hasn't actually changed that much at all in terms of the levels. But you can also see the flip side of well, no, maybe now teens are finally getting the sleep they need, which they rarely ever do because of the adolescent shift and how the world works. They don't get enough sleep, and they're allowed to use their phones and tablets more, which is obviously a constant source of stress to their parents. But now they have no alternative. So you can see that, but also societal factors. The whole thing of the classic fear of missing out, FOMO, is not necessarily an issue right now. Like something when you're an adolescent, especially, like your social psychology is such a big part of it. Your social awareness, your wanting to belong, fear of being left out and not part of the group is a big concern during your late teens and early adulthood. But that's not an issue right now because no one's doing anything of any interest. So you can't really miss out on that. And anything that's happened online. So you get to feel more included. And is also the thing of the modern world has a lot of stresses which involve things that you're responsible for. You have to do this for your work. You have to progress in that. And these have all been taken away for at least temporarily. As in, well, my job's not going anywhere, but that's not my fault right now because no one's in work. I can't do anything, and it's not my fault. And I think that you can't really underestimate how big a relief that can be in a lot of cases of someone with anxiety, or even if low level, not even clinical, just general overly stressed, low level anxiety, things like that can be alleviated somewhat by just the knowledge that whatever's happening isn't down to you, and that's a big load off for a lot of people.
Oh, go on, Suzi. Did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think I don't know whether other people found this, but I found over the summer when restrictions were lifted, I found that quite a difficult time where some people were going out every night and going to the pub and that kind of thing, and particularly people who were in higher risk groups probably weren't doing that.
Suzi, you're not talking about me, are you?
About myself, actually. But that's where I think it's potentially challenging when things do start to change, and that's when I think sort of fear of missing out and worrying about being left out of social groups and that kind of thing. If we do end up, and I'm hoping that we won't, with this kind of divided society where people who feel like they're low risk can go out all the time and people who are worried that they're higher risk feel like they shouldn't be going out, I think that's potentially when problems could arise in terms of anxiety and that sort of thing.
Well, I think that's what they keep saying about good government messaging, and that the certainty is a lot more helpful than uncertainty. This thing of there's 16 different tier levels. Some of them you can go to the pub at 9:53 p.m. but no later. What? You don't know what the situation is. That can be a lot more stressful than just knowing, even if it's worse. No, you can't. It's much more reassuring than
we don't really know. Do what you like. Yeah.
And Nav, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean the uncertainty and the relentlessness are not good for mental health. I just wanted to pick up on one thing Dean said, and he's absolutely right. For some kids, it's withdrawal from social contact might be quite helpful. On average, one of the things we do know is unfortunately kids' levels of psychological health have gone down a bit. There was a big survey from the UNS a couple of weeks ago. What was interesting, I think, in particular about that survey is mental health was worse in kids whose household had challenging financial situations. A challenging financial environment made all this worse for kids. And the other thing that made things worse for kids, that mental health was worse in kids who didn't get support from school as well. So if we're thinking about our kids' mental health, they're two really important things we can do.
Well, we'll just carry on that a little bit, because Sarah Dove asked the question a little bit about the impact on children's development, but also how do we understand the potential long-term impacts of this? Who can comment on that? Nav, is that one for you?
I can start, and then someone else can come up with a sensible answer. I think I was struck yesterday. I was having a wander around my bit of South Manchester, and there are quite a lot of young kids being pushed around in their buggies, and for some of them, and for some friends' kids as well, they've missed out on that. It's just the level at which they're going to come out, they're going to start playing with their mates, but they haven't been able to do it. And, certainly one or two people have contacted me, they're a bit kind of worried about that. The first thing to say is that kids are incredibly kind of resilient, and so for the majority of them, they're going to bounce back from this. So a bit of kind of lack of social contact early on won't, I think, for most kids, have poor, have long-term effects. For the other things, for me, I've got 3 kids, they're teenagers now, so the opposite end from Suzi. But for them, the key things are going to be making sure they still go to school. So understand, mitigating any long-term effects by that. sporting activities, kind of exercise, and the connectedness. And that's a double-edged sword. They're not seeing their mates in person, they're seeing them online, but maintaining those things, I think, will help mitigate the effect on kids' kind of development. I think that's what we should be looking at, really.
Yeah.
Go on, Suzi.
Really important, and I think one of the things that's really difficult is we don't get to know about the long-term effects yet. However, what we can do is learn from this to look to the future. So what is happening right now is basically a natural experiment, and in epidemiology we've used these kind of natural experiments in the past where something, and it's usually something awful, something happens to a population, and you can collect data during that time and learn from it and think about things in the future. So there have been examples in the past where things like famine have happened in certain places, or even when changes in policy happen and different populations experience different things. So while it's not a very useful answer for right now, what I really hope is that we can learn things from this, because a pandemic could happen again. Like, I mean, it's difficult to talk about that now when we're in the middle of one. I don't really want to be this.
Come on, Suzi, we're supposed to be cheering people up.
As I was saying this, I was like, keep it light. but you know, we have this great opportunity to actually learn things to help us in the future, and I really hope that we do that.
Well, there's another question here. We'll move on a little bit to another anonymous question, which is a really interesting thing, and it's kind of about coming out of this a little bit. But the questioner says we've already done one lockdown, and that was much more severe than this one. But this person says, although we're prepared this time, we know what to expect, and this lockdown isn't as strict, they're finding it much harder psychologically. Now, I think you've touched on some of the reasons for this, but why might the second one, the less extreme one, be harder than the first one? Dean?
Part of that might be that the first one, again, it was all new, it was all novel, and there was the sense of camaraderie, we're all in this together and stuff, and that's been very, very firmly eroded away in many ways by various social political factors. So
I was very diplomatic of you. Well done.
Yes, and I don't want to sort of point fingers, but I will if it comes down to it.
Go on.
What? Well, look. Okay.
Yeah.
not sure what that achieves, but okay. But yeah, but it's anyway, so it's a lot more. We know a lot more now. So like you can look at this as saying like, oh well, we know who's going to do what, and like this is bad. They shouldn't have come to this. There's also that. But I think there's a big part of it of when you come out of the first lockdown. I think there was a genuine sense of, oh well, that's it now. We've done our thing. Yeah. Once it starts happening again, then you're like, well, there's nothing to say now that this is the final one. This could become. I think when you got a second example, it becomes like far more accepted as the new normal. Whereas the previous lockdown, however strict it was, like this is weird, but we'll get through it. And this one is like, oh, so this is my life now, and that's a lot more of a bleak or a lot less satisfying, and a lot less positive outlook to have. But it's sort of kind of inevitable.
They never show that bit in the movies, do they? It's always the first bit of drama, and then I mean the cultural stories we tell are that a thing happens and then it stops happening.
Yeah, definitely. And also like the Simpsons even made jokes about it when they're trying to get the bathroom door open. One coat hanger through didn't work, and try to get something else. And then the door's open, and the release they said, "How do you do that?" Because I used the coat hanger again. I don't understand why we never try things once. And it's like it's a common thing in mainstream media that you do it once, it's done, then you go do something else. But that's not.
No one makes a movie about there was no Contagion 2, for example.
No, exactly.
I think the other thing was like spring, and the sun was shining constantly, and we could go outside even if it was just for an hour. So it was, at least the world was bright, whereas you look out the window now and you're like, oh God, really? It's raining again. It's grey. It's dark when I wake up and it's dark when I go to sleep. I mean, not quite, but it's not spring anymore.
It's clearly my job to be the upbeat one. I think you're right. I think you're right, and I'm very sorry that the person that's written in with the question. Yeah, I know people who have found this much harder second time around. But just like from the medical point of view, we know about treatments. We're much better at treating COVID-19. I would argue that on the whole, we're more prepared for some of the kind of psychological aspects. It's not going to be as strange. queuing up at the supermarket, wearing masks. We're all used to that now. We've taken some time, many of us, to kind of find out what works for us, whether it's a bit of exercise, whether it's a bit of mindfulness, whether it's other things, the importance of kind of eating well. We know the shops aren't going to run out of food. So I think for some people, definitely the relentlessness, the uncertainty, the fact that it's been repeated. But I think on the whole, we'll get through this, actually, and hopefully we'll manage it even better than we did lockdown 1.
So we are going to move on. Oh God, we're going to move on from COVID a little bit. But just before we do that, could I ask each of you for 1 or 2 tips that for the second lockdown? As you said, it's the winter. Here we go again. It's all a bit rubbish. Brexit's coming. What coping strategies, that maybe not the obvious ones, but what are the little things either that you found helpful or that you really recommend to other people? Suzi, do you want to go first?
It is going walking, like getting out of the house every day. I think also something that we should probably all be doing during the sort of autumn winter kind of time is taking vitamin D supplements as well. Like it is actually recommended by the NHS, although I don't think many people know that we during the sort of winter months, particularly if you live in the north of England like I do, it can be really helpful. But yeah, trying to get at least some sunlight in the day is something I find helpful. Rescheduling those Zoom quizzes, that kind of thing. It's tough when you do a job where you're constantly on video calls all day, and like that's the work that I do. So I know what it's like to have 7 hours of Zoom meetings in a day, and the last thing you really want to do is get on a video call in the evening. But whenever I do, to speak to friends, it always makes me feel better. So I think keeping that communication and actually seeing people as well, that's what I find really helpful.
Okay, top tips, Nav. Nav.
For me, it's really been the acknowledgement that some days are not going to be very good, and some days I'm not going to feel absolutely great. And actually, the realization that some days I'm not going to feel so good is quite a helpful one in some ways, because I get through that day, and then the next day is a bit better. And it's one of the things that we've talked about in our kind of university department as well. That sometimes you're going to have bad days, and that's right. The other thing I've found really helpful is there's a kind of basis, a therapeutic basis for it. It's got activity scheduling. So it's basically, if you've got some tasks, rather than putting them off, actually trying to do them, because once I've managed a couple of tasks in the morning, it's much easier then to get going. So that kind of activity scheduling has been really helpful for me.
Brilliant. And Dean?
Don't bring the tone down again, but I'm finding this lockdown somewhat easier because I haven't lost any close family members this time around, which is usually a good step up. But I think it sort of echoes Nav's recommendation that I'm finding it does help if you have plans, and not even just necessarily tasks. Like, don't sort of think, right, I'm in lockdown, but now I'm gonna, that means I'm on limbo. My life is frozen. If you can make any sort of plan, even if it's like a small scale thing, or if it's like just a short project, which shows like this hasn't been wasted time, this hasn't been your life on pause. Just having some sort of landmark in your head, you can say, right, I've done that. This whole period was me doing this, so I'm working towards that now. So it doesn't seem like it's everything's in stasis, everything's on hold. Just a sense of progress can be quite helpful in terms of, well, again, this is a lockdown, but I'm getting through it. And sometimes I think, oh God, I've only got a week left of lockdown. I better get this done, and it becomes more like a normal job, which maybe you don't want, but you can have.
So I'm going to use that to go into a question which actually came from me, but is relevant to what you just said. And in the first lockdown science shambles, none of us can quite remember how long ago that was, but it's a long time. I apparently said that I wasn't feeling too worried because it was very much like life at sea. And the questioner is wondering if I still feel like that after 7 to 8 months. But one of the things that I said at the time about back in March, which you just reminded me of, is that when you're at sea, you're on a ship, basically days of the week don't matter. You're just there. You eat dinner in the same place every day. You see the same people every day. Your routine, you work every day because you're not going to have weekends when you've got this kind of special time on the ship, even if you're there for 2 months. But one of the things that we do at sea, especially for the longer voyages, is exactly what Dean just said, is we create things. So every Saturday on the last time, or time before I went to sea, we would have a sort of special dinner, and it wasn't particularly special dinner because it was still the ship, but everyone they found a tablecloth from somewhere, and everyone put on a slightly nicer shirt, and that was the Saturday dinner. And those things that mark time, I think those are really important, because if you feel like you're drifting, then it really gets really hard. And then certainly certainly at sea, those you and the thing that's interesting about doing it at sea is that it's obviously entirely artificial, right? It's so obvious that you are making this up. Like there was like an anniversary when I was on Odin of the 30 years since that ship had been the first non-nuclear icebreaker to get to the North Pole. It doesn't matter at all. And the captain was like, right, we're having a drinks party, because that's the Swedish way of dealing with everything. And that was before the silly hat party and the crayfish party and the various other, and some of the times the scientists were like, what are they up to now, these Swedish people? But those things are really like those markers in time. That's really
it's not just the markers as well. That's a really cracking kind of point, really. It's about and we've tried to do this. I've tried to do this with varying degrees of success in my household, but it's just trying to introduce a bit of variety into life. So I've dusted off the old kind of projector, and we try and have movie night. And most nights I'm the only person in our kind of makeshift cinema in our top room. But hey, it's trying to introduce that kind of element of variety in what would otherwise be very mundane and routine, and just being creative. So I loved your drinks party and suggestions for how you make things special. I think that's really important.
And so to answer that, so I still do feel the same way about lockdown. It is like life at sea, but I tell you what I miss actually is that at sea, the thing that is very different for me is that at sea you are working with a very close-knit group of people. You have a very strong immediate community. You're the only people in your world, but you still have 10 of them or 30 of them or whatever it is, and you get to know each other really well. Just even people you've never met before, you just become you become this little village. And that's the one thing that I notice about the lockdowns, is that actually the village doesn't really exist, at least for me, in the same. I know some people who've got streets, and they've got people who come out on their street and they've all got to know each other, and it works a little bit like that. But the hardest thing is not having that really tight, because if you've got a really tight community, you sort of don't need anything else. And that has been different. Okay, let's move on to some other questions about general mental health. So we're gonna go to a very different type of question, but I really like this question. I think this is really interesting, and I suspect that this person heard Chris Boardman on Desert Island Discs the other week, because I think he addressed this. And the questioner says, can you explore the levels of acceptability of obsession in elite and extreme sport versus obsessional behaviors in other aspects of life? And they point out that if an athlete is standing on the podium getting a gold medal at the Olympics, everyone says, oh, they're very dedicated. That's a brilliant thing. But if someone has an obsession with a repetitive behavior, for example, that is seen as a detriment. And yet if the obsessional behavior was getting on a cycling track, then there's a fine line there. Where does that divide come, and what should and shouldn't be acceptable? Who's going to go? I'm going to pick who. Dean.
I'll do it. It's fine. Yeah. Well, I think it's a really good question, because it sort of gets really down to the bedrock of what counts as a mental health problem or a mental disorder, however you want to talk about it. Because it's in my current book. It's really hard to sort of pin down exactly where mental health goes from being okay to not okay. There's no fine line there. It's not like with physical ailments. I know it's a lot more ambiguous than people think, but if your elbow's facing the wrong way, if your skin's turned yellow and you're leaking pus, you're like, well, that's not meant to be happening, is it? That's probably a bad thing. But it's kind of hard to make that judgment call when it comes to mental health stuff. So we have a lot of parameters in place, because the mental health or the mental performance of someone is a lot more whether it's good or not, or whether it counts as acceptable or unacceptable, or bad or good, or helpful and unhelpful, is a lot more of a social construct, and that can change over time. Like I think I mentioned it last time, but it's only in the 1970s that homosexuality was declassified as a mental illness, and we don't think that's the case anymore, but that was the accepted standard for a while. And it's sort of like basing your parameters for what is good or bad mental health on social norms, sort of like anchoring your boat to a cow. It's big and solid, but it's going to wander off eventually, and then you're going to be in a different place. And that
depends on the boat and the cow.
Well, exactly. Yes, but regarding this particular question, it's like one of the things that say, how do you define whether someone's mental behavior or like actions are good or bad? Is like, are they maladaptive? As in, do they do you any damage? Do you do any harm to yourself or to your society? And with a lot of sessions, yes, they do. As in, someone with OCD who cannot stop classic washing their hands, that's very common now, I suppose, or cannot stop flicking light switches, that impinges on their life. It makes it worse. It's a problem for them to fix. Whereas someone on the cycle track, constantly spending all day in the gym, is by our standards, improving their life, improving their abilities, making themselves fitter and healthier and stronger and faster. So we don't recognise that as being a problem because it's beneficial to them. It's not maladaptive. And again, I guess at the root cause, that's the main difference in someone with an obsession disorder is doing things which aren't helpful. Someone directing that sort of obsession to sport or self-achievement is being helpful to themselves and society by the values we impinge on it. So yeah, that's where the main difference lies as far as I could tell you. Nav may have a different episode.
well, let's come to Suzi first, and then Nav can maybe round these two things up. So Suzi, how does this work, especially with taking I mean, drugs is a loaded word in some ways, but substances, because you read back, there was a period when taking laudanum was a very fashionable thing to do in London society, and a period in the 60s when LSD and these things were the height. If you wanted to be a great creative artist, you were high on everything all the time. How does this interact? When is it good and when is it bad?
Well, I was when I saw this question, it made me think about addiction science, because it's sort of the way we kind of define, or one possible way of defining addiction is when your life has been knocked off course by your relationship with, well, usually a substance, but it doesn't have to be a substance. So it could also be something like gambling, or potentially it could be anything. It could be exercise, or it could be going on the cycling track, it could be playing the drums, it could be whatever. It's where your life has been knocked off kilter. So your personal relationships, your work, or your ability to sort of progress your life the way you want it to be, I guess. And I think that sometimes these kind of extreme sporting behaviours could potentially fall into that trap if you're going to the cycling track so much that your family relationships or your emotional relationships.
Well, if you speak to any Olympic athlete, they will absolutely say that their family relationships have suffered, like almost universally, in my experience.
There is potentially a way that could be maladaptive. It's adaptive in some ways and maladaptive in other ways. And I think, cultural expectation has a huge impact on this as well. As you say, like we think about the way we treat alcohol compared to the way we treat other drugs in terms of acceptability, and a lot of the ways in which people interact with alcohol are probably extremely maladaptive, and yet you have to get much further down that path before it's seen as a problem compared to how it would if it was another substance that's currently illicit. And maybe caffeine is also relevant here, in that pretty much all of us who drink coffee are dependent on caffeine, and yet I don't think anyone really sees that as a problem, because is it really maladaptive?
Well, people are proud of it, aren't they? They're proud of being. I'm not a coffee drinker, actually. I like the smell of it, but I don't like the bitterness of the taste. But it's always. I feel like I walk into coffee conversations with this extreme nervousness, because people are exceptionally proud of. And I think a lot of the. I don't know. This is just my own little thing, but I think a lot of the pride in the best coffee and knowing the best coffee is basically covering up the behaviour. Because if they're turning it into a virtue, that they're coffee connoisseurs, then they don't have to face up to how much of the stuff they're drinking. Well, maybe I'm being mean.
Yes, you're being mean, Helen.
Are you a coffee drinker by any chance?
Maladaptiveness comes in is how much do people spend on their coffee? Like you're sort of potentially that could be problematic if you get into a real coffee habit.
Nav, what do you think about obsession? When does obsession?
I think it's absolutely fascinating. So it's partly about illness as a social construct. So both Dean and Suzi have been talking about basically when it kind of is bad. Either Dean was talking about, well, societally kind of bad, we think it's kind of maladaptive, but also personally bad. So if I'm doing something and it's actually making me feel miserable, then it's a bit of a problem. Whereas actually, the other bit of that is very kind of goal directed, but it's a kind of social construct, but also it kind of varies over. So it's this idea of impairment, but it also kind of varies over time, which I think is fascinating, which suggests if it varies over time, it's not a kind of solid construct. This is not a cast iron construct. There's an element of subjectivity about this. But probably the most important thing is how, if you like, traits that in some circumstances can be not good, can be maladaptive, can in other senses be really helpful. And that isn't just obsessions, it's other things as well that, sometimes we look at, these psychological things purely in terms of disorder. That's wrong, because actually sometimes these psychological traits can be helpful.
Well, let's move on to one of those. So we have a question here from Eileen Cheng, who's a long-time patron supporter. And she, when you're talking about behaviours that are compulsive, I would say for our producer Trent and Robin, that organising shows is pretty much a compulsion. And so Eileen has asked a question about how organising, producing and hosting a non-stop live 24-hour show will affect your mental health and how they might or should cope with it. So there's a lot in there. I certainly, well, like, you know, when Trent told me, I was like, oh, of course you're going to do that. Yep. Right. You're going to regret that. He swears they're not. But Suzi, coping mechanisms. Let's deal with the coping mechanisms first. How do people use coping mechanisms, and how much should we rely on them when we have a big thing like that to get ready for?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really good question, and when I spoke to Trent about it, the thing that he said is coffee. So we could come back to caffeine again, stimulants basically to help them stay awake. But I think one of the things that's going to be really important, like at least you know the finite length of time it's going to take. I mean, although having said that, this is Shambles, so it's obviously going to overrun. But you know roughly the parameters, so you know how long you have to keep going for. And I think that's incredibly helpful when you've got to do a really difficult or sort of endurance task, is knowing, in a way, it's kind of easier than some sort of like marathon type thing where you know the length of it. If you know the time of it, you know exactly how long you've got to keep going for. And also that's something that they've done that I think is incredibly important when you're doing something like this, is to have a strong team that you trust and you know, and that you're a sort of this core group who can work together, and you know that you can work together, and you know that you kind of know that you can do it. I think that's going to be incredibly important for the Shambles team for this event. But yeah, I mean, rather them than me.
Dean, what are the mental health implications of even trying to do something like that?
This is an odd situation because you're trying to ask me to use Trent and Robin as normal subjects, which I would never even deign to do, because that's clearly a ridiculous question. It's one of those things like, I don't think, well, I know that they have done this before, but I'm not sure how much things like this have happened. I know there's been like 24-hour or like 5-day long non-stop radio marathon sessions and things like that. So I don't know if they have any particular aspects of that. Obviously, sleep deprivation is not necessarily a good thing, but from Robin's output, he doesn't sleep much anyway, so it's not really an issue. And yeah, I think I'm not sure about coping mechanisms, but I think one of the main things with, obviously, they put these big, huge shows on anyway, and perhaps one of the main reasons you get through this and keep coming back to it and enjoy it so much is because the results are immediate. Like, then you go on stage, you say something, the audience laughs, the audience reacts positively, then you can see the people there. You know that what you're doing has an impact, as a consequence, and therefore your efforts are validated and justified, and they feel like they've been spent wisely. That could be more of a challenge here because obviously it's a remote show. There's going to be, I know they might have some audience there, but it's not going to be anywhere near like the usual output. So I would encourage anyone who wants to sort of support the effort to send feedback to confirm, like, yes, I'm enjoying this. This is great. Please, not even necessarily.
Even if they're not enjoying it,
enjoying it. Otherwise, you're a bad person. You're causing someone harm. So yes.
So this is officially recommended. Our mental health panel, please talk to us while these shows are going on, because we'd like to know you're there. And it's definitely, when we did the one that was meant to be at the Albert Hall Sea Shambles back in May, and I was sitting next door just talking to a screen for 4 hours, and it was what in a way that the other one wasn't, and because I was just talking to myself. Nav, what go on.
Yeah, no. So look, you've got to all be prepared. So you're not going to do this, but in the week beforehand, be extra nice to yourself. Make sure you get loads of sleep. This thing is coming, and actually it's going to be really good for your mental health because you're going to have this huge thing you're all kind of working towards. So the prep, I think, is key. The other thing you talked about, which I was struck by, is this kind of, pretend you're all at sea, the kind of siege mentality. It's you, Robin and Trent against the world. That kind of,
there's others.
Cohesion.
Yes. There's a big team.
It's a cohesion. And then the other thing is, just be nice to each other and support each other. But I think it's fantastic. I think it's exciting. And I think overall it will have positive effects for all of your mental health, as long as people, A, donate lots of money to charity, and B, give you loads of positive feedback.
Well, thank you for doing the plug so I don't have to. We're going to move on to, I think we might have some way of assessing not mental health, but tiredness. I think we might have a guest who's going to just keep an eye on Robin as it's going along. So yes. So we've got a live question from the question feed or somewhere like that from James Whitney. And this is going back to slightly more serious things, but so a quick answer would be great. What are the biggest gaps in mental health services at the moment? What are the problems? I mean, we're all becoming more aware of mental health during the pandemic. Where are the gaps? Suzi.
Well, in terms of my field, there have been really big problems with drug services being cut in recent years. Drug services, smoking cessation services, all of this kind of thing have all really been cut. And there's also a bit of a problem in that quite often substance misuse problems and mental health problems co-occur at higher rates than you would expect. And what has historically happened is if you've got this co-occurring problems, it's harder to get treatment for either, because the mental health services want you to sort out your substance use before they will work with you, and the substance use services want you to sort out your mental health before they'll work with you. And this is getting better. We're learning much more about these treatments, but they require specialist sort of interventions, and with services being cut, these are harder and harder to find. So that's sort of that's my area of research, but it's something that we are lacking.
Dean, where do you see the gaps being?
I can not know it's particularly specific, but I think a lot of it boils down to just simply not enough people to provide the services we need. In that, you get a lot of the like the punditry saying about mental health problems aren't really that bad. It's all about an attempt to push meds on people, and I don't know. There's an argument to be had there for the influence of pharmaceutical industries in mental health care, but the bottom line is, massively overstretched medical service like the NHS. You got the choice of either you can either give someone 6 weeks worth of 1 hour a week or talking therapy sessions with a trained professional one-on-one, or you give them a box of pills, which I happen to have already on hand, and that's going to become the more obvious route, because it's a question of you can either wait 6 or 7 months to speak to someone who's trained to do this over many, many years, and while they're doing that with you, they can't do it with anyone else, or you can have a box of pills, which is going to potentially could fix or help matters. But I think so much of mental health therapies are people, human-led, person-led, they require interaction and engagement with a trained professional, and we just don't have enough of those at the moment, and we could stand to have a lot more.
And Nav, where do you see the gaps?
Basically, I think there's 3 things. First is access. So if I'm psychologically unwell, can I get the access to the treatments I need? The second thing for me is transition. So when people move from one bit of the service to the other, does information get lost? Are things handed over? They can be quite risky periods. And the third thing for me as a kind of mental health researcher is implementation. So it's brilliant mental health research that goes on there. One of the things I've kind of joked about is actually I'm going to stop doing any research and focus on implementing stuff now, just to kind of reassure people, we're well aware of this, and we are trying to work hard to kind of plug those gaps. So we're not just sitting on our hands. But yeah, you're right, there are significant problems, but that's how I'd see them.
Well, the thing that I think is positive is that people are talking about this a lot more, and nothing is going to get fixed if it's hidden. So the more it's talked about, the more. And I think there's a lot of help available online, which obviously isn't the same as professional help, but it might open a few doors for people
and can be really helpful.
This next one's for you, Dean. Moving on again to a different topic. Anonymous poster has said that they understand that high anxiety, fight or flight was incredibly advantageous when you're surrounded by big things with teeth, or potentially surrounded by big things with big teeth that were trying to eat you. And the problem is we've still got it. And we, at least here in the UK, generally don't have a tiger just down the road. But has there just not been enough time for this to evolve out to the population, or does it actually still have a use?
Well, no, that's exactly the problem, in that those the fight or flight systems are threat detection mechanisms in our brain, which are highly sensitive to look for any sorts of dangers. They evolved over millions upon millions of years. And a lot of them are intrinsically linked to the very fundamental, deepest parts of our brain, and we share them with many other species who have similar reflexes, similar processes. And we're not surrounded by predators at all times at the moment, literal predators which are going to eat us. But that change in our environment has only come about in the last, maybe let's say 10,000 years, which is like this morning in evolutionary terms. So there just simply hasn't been enough time for these systems to go away. But what has happened in many ways is the human brain's become a sort of victim of his own success, because we can now envisage and comprehend a much wider range of threats. Things like, will this cost me my job? Am I going to be embarrassed by this? If the economy goes down, am I going to be able to afford my mortgage? What if I didn't do this? What if I got the wrong flight? These are all things which have no direct physical harm potential, but we worry about them anyway. But the part of the brain which handles stress and worry is the same one. So it reacts the same to, could I lose my job, to there is a wolf next to me. And no, maybe not to the same extent, but it's the same system being triggered by both, because we are far more aware of possible threats now of their intangible nature, but the same system in the brain is there to sort of cause a stress reaction now, which, according to a lot of research, is what underlies a lot of mental health problems in the modern age. So yes, it just simply hasn't been enough time for this to go away yet.
So Nav, do we want it to go away? I mean, does it have uses?
So this is absolutely fascinating. Dean's absolutely right about the time, but there's also the idea that these aren't simple genetic disorders. They're a combination of the vulnerability we carry in our genes and what happens to us. So that's another thing. And the other thing is, are certain traits actually adaptive? And we've already talked about how they might be, and in fact, the fight or flight, the anxiety response, can be helpful, will be helpful to you when you're running your 24-hour show. That the adrenaline that's going to be flowing, the fight or flight, that's going to help you put on an even better show. But even for more kind of serious mental disorders, people with bipolar affective disorders, sometimes people have periods of heightened activity that can be really adaptive. So some writers, some academics have talked about mental illness being almost part and parcel of the human condition, and for the majority of the population it's adaptive, but sometimes for a small proportion of people it kind of it's almost maladaptive. So I think
by adaptive you mean that it's useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think I'm not sure that we don't want people to suffer. We want to have brilliant access to people with psychological health problems and brilliant treatments, but our emotions, we're not going to make our emotions and our differential response to situations go away. That's part of what being human means.
And Suzi, just on the fight or flight thing, presumably one of the reasons people use drugs is to enhance or to is the fight or flight mechanism part of recreational drug use? Do people use it? Is it a tool that people use drugs to play with or to enhance, or is it just a completely separate thing?
I think potentially, yeah. There's definitely a lot of evidence that people who experience anxiety might be more likely to use substances to manage their anxiety. I mean, certainly social anxiety is something that people say that they use alcohol to deal with. Like lots and lots of people say that, where I mean, and we've all probably done it to a greater or lesser extent. If you're going out to a party with your partner and all of their friends that you don't know, you're going to be more relaxed after you've had, or you're going to feel more relaxed potentially after you've had a drink. It's going to be easier to talk to strangers, that kind of thing. And so that sort of using substances like that to kind of manage anxiety is potentially what people do. It's not necessarily a good idea though, and certainly not longer term, because what tends to happen is that if you start to rely on a substance as a crutch in that kind of way, then your relationship with it fundamentally or can change into a relationship whereby you feel like you need it each time, and that can really be a predictor of then developing problematic use, increasing use, and relying on it in a way that's unhealthy and potentially really, really damaging. So it might seem to work in the short term, or particularly alcohol as well. You might feel better that evening, but the next day you're probably going to feel worse, and longer term it's definitely not a good strategy.
Well, at least your body's got a feedback mechanism to tell you. As Dean said, you get an immediate response pretty much to what happens. Okay, we are out of time. We did not get through all the questions, but thank you to our three brilliant guests, Dean and Nav and Suzi. A reminder that the 24-hour show will start on December the 12th and finish on December the 13th at some point, as Suzi said, probably not on time, but hey. So that's 9 Lessons and Carols for Socially Distanced People. The documentary on I've forgotten the name temporarily. An Uncanny Hour is out for Patreon supporters now. And yes, we hope to see you next week. Do support us on Patreon if you can. And thank you very much, and see you next week.
Bye, everyone.